Hello everyone, and welcome to my presentation. Today we're going to be talking about paralysis, a CC effect I'd like to see introduced into League of Legends. Paralysis is basically a stun for cooldowns. If you are afflicted with paralysis, any active abilities you have on cooldown will have their cooldowns frozen for a set period of time. It's important to note that you can still move, basic attack, and cast abilities as long as those abilities were not on cooldown prior to becoming paralyzed. If you do cast an ability while paralyzed, however, that ability's cooldown will immediately freeze for the remainder of the debuff's duration. To clarify, this is technically crowd control, but it only affects your ability to cast spells. If you're still confused, however, another way to think of how it functions is as an addition to the remaining cooldown of any abilities you have. I think being able to critically disable your enemy in one pass is a really cool and satisfying thing to skillfully do in not just League, but all competitive games in general. And I found myself wondering one day about how designers go about making those moments possible while also making them fair for the receiving player. I also happen to be working on a champion rework whose kit revolved around stuns, and combining the two, things just flowed naturally. Now, in theory, paralysis as an effect can be considered weak against, if not countered outright by, champions who do the bulk of their damage through basic attacks rather than abilities, champions with either extremely low base cooldowns or who have achieved low cooldowns through stacking high amounts of ability haste, and, generally speaking, players who have the skills to avoid abilities that would otherwise paralyze them. Although paralysis isn't a hard CC effect, I believe it to be as strong as one. Not every champ should have it, not every stun should have it, and any ability that has paralysis included within its effects should be considered as having a silence baked into it, when accounting for that champion's kit's power budget. Here is a good place to mention that I think immobilizing and other loss of control effects should generally be tied to proportionate levels of skill checks, such as requiring landing skill shots, having long cast time that need to be accounted for in the lead up, and being cancelable due to requiring long charge times. Focusing on giving love to older champs with much simpler kits, through the addition of paralysis to some of their otherwise one-note abilities and kits might be a great way to bring them back up to par for viability and meaningful play rates. Some champions gaining the ability to slow down enemy spell rotations, punish bad engages without necessarily wasting their only pick abilities, and generally stall out fights longer in order to buy time for either their own allies or their own longer cooldowns through paralysis might be a potential answer, if not at least a check, to the ever-increasing mobility creep and cooldown spamming we see in League of Legends today. For some more direct examples, think of these kinds of champions when picturing newly paralyzing abilities in-game. For me, Bard's ult is the first that comes to mind. Imagine that ally stasis does what it already does, but enemy stasis now also comes with the added effect of paralyzing affected enemies' cooldowns. If nothing else, this should make those underappreciated good Bard ults more easy to spot and the bad ones much more costly. Same thing here with Lissandra's ult. What if choosing to heal herself came at the opportunity cost of not only stunning a primary enemy target's movement, but also their cooldowns? Of course, power would have to be taken elsewhere out of her kit in order to account for this kind of buff, but I imagine such a change would send Liss's viability and credibility as a lockdown champ through the roof. In short, maybe reducing the power of dashes and other movement speed bonuses won't make more a fun game. Similarly, maybe increasing the frequency and or availability of immobilizing spells within the game won't either. No one likes getting hit with Morgana's Dark Biting, but a modern-day League of Legends without Morgana being able to at least threaten opponents with being stuck in place for up to 3 seconds would probably make for a game that more nobodies wouldn't like. In order to find a fair and most enjoyable middle ground, I propose Riot's designers consider expanding their thinking and their arsenal when it comes to anti-systems abuse design. Swap out some stuns for silences and slows, swap out some snares for slows and disarms, swap out some silences and stuns for paralysis, and think more out of the box with matching what a champion's abilities do thematically versus how they execute in-game. As alluded to prior, while I don't think something like a brand stun combo should get a paralysis baked into it, I do think it could be more useful if more abilities were designed with specific counterplay and anti-synergies in mind, rather than surface-level analogs that lead to ideas like people often trip over bushes in the forest, so Zyra's E should literally just snare movement. Kassadin the Anti-Mage, for instance, could be reintroduced into the game with paralysis in his kit, as an extra layer of power and depth when picked as an answer to a mage backup in the mid lane. Perhaps instead of simply doing inevitable tons of damage as a reward for surviving into the late game, Kassadin could instead wield the capacity to periodically silence, interrupt, and paralyze within his kit in order to disrupt and dismantle his cooldown-reliant foes. Some closing thoughts. So, paralysis could potentially be balanced by not affecting any cooldowns other than active or non-passive abilities. This means that it would not affect items, summoner spells, and so on, and maybe even things like Zac and Azir's passives. I personally think it appropriate for it to extend to things like that in order for it to exist as an even more clear response to those kinds of champions. But for me, that's just how I feel, and I'm open for debate in the comments. I also find the idea of paralysis not being affected by tenacity to be absurdly interesting, meaning tenacity won't reduce the length of your paralysis, mainly because silence already is affected by tenacity, but paralysis is supposed to be like silence cosplaying on opposite day, and there aren't enough system level checks and balances in the game already, in my opinion. The question of paralysis being unaffected by tenacity opens up Pandora's box, but I think this is worth Riot's design team considering. Further in-game systems operating in a rock, paper, scissors faction could open the door for even more new items, item synergies, build experimentation, and so on. More unique game situations and more memorable problem-solving scenarios in every single game context. I talk a bit more about these ideas on a few essays over on my blog, so check the description for links to that. If you're not tempted enough just from hearing that, however, I challenge you to pause here in the video, check out the bullet points currently on screen, and write up your objections in the comments below. I'm always open to new ideas and ways to think about game design, and would find your perspective to be a great inspiration for a future essay or video. In conclusion, paralysis is a novel concept crowd control effect that aims to put more meaning into managing and negotiating ability cooldowns, both your own and your enemies. Cooldowns are an exceedingly integral part of League in today's climate, especially when you consider that most of the 200 years memes stem from all new champions having one or multiple dashes, and I believe that the proper implementation of paralysis could be both a compelling and engaging means for navigating this increasingly fast-paced game environment. More than absolutely anything, I just think this hypothetical debuff is a really cool effect that could be introduced into the game, and one that would heighten the experience of playing some mages, lockdown tanks, and the occasional anti-meta pick especially. I've already dabbled in designing some new champions with it in mind, and likely will in the future. Thank you to my patrons for encouraging and supporting the work that I do. If you would like to join this community, consider visiting my Patreon. If nothing else, it's free to subscribe, and doing so will keep you up to date with everything I share online everywhere. Thank you for watching.